Have you ever had a friend named Mr. Tickle? How about little Miss Giggles or Mr. Topsy-Turvy? They are just a few of hundreds of silly characters that entertain us in the series from Roger Hargreaves, introduced to us beginning in 1971. In the story of Mr. Noisy, we meet Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon, and they find an interesting way to solve a problem they are having with Mr. Noisy. With a name like Mr. Noisy, can you imagine what the problem might be? I hope you enjoy the story of Mr. Noisy and his adventures in Wobbletown. Mr. Noisy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Noisy is a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy were reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But Achoo! From Mr. Noisy, you can hear in the next country. Now, this story starts with Mr. Noisy asleep in his bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which is on the top of a hill. He is snoring. And as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of running elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting his door behind him. Mr. Wobble, he wobbled. The house wobbled. The whole house wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying above Wobbletown wobbled. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. He walked into the baker's shop. Went the door as he opened it. Went the door as he shut it. "I'd like a loaf of bread!" boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb the baker. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. When he got to the butcher shop, went the door as he opened it. Went the door as he shut it. "I'd like a piece of meat!" boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon met in the street. "We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy," she said. "Absolutely," replied Mr. Bacon. "But what?" "I know," said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. "Miss Crumb," he said, "I think you have the answer." The following day, Mr. Noisy again went down to Wobbletown to shop. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. "I'd like a loaf of bread!" he boomed. "Sorry." "What did you say?" Mrs. Crumb said, pretending not to hear. "I'd like a loaf of bread!" Mr. Noisy shouted. "Sorry," said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. "Can you speak up, please?" "I'd like a loaf of bread!" roared Mr. Noisy. "Can't hear you," replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Mr. Noisy went to Mr. Bacon's shop. "I'd like a piece of meat!" Mr. Noisy boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. "I'd like a piece of meat!" Mr. Noisy shouted. "Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon. "I said I'd like a piece of meat!" roared Mr. Noisy. "Pardon?" said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out and went home and went to bed hungry. The next day, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went to Mrs. Crumb's shop. "I'd like a loaf of bread!" he boomed. What?" asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the top of his voice, "A loaf of—" And then he stopped And then he thought, and he quietly said, "I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb." Mrs. Crumb smiled. "Certainly." Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. "I'd like a piece of meat," he boomed. "Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon. "Yes, I did!" shouted Mr. Noisy at the very top of his voice. "I said I'd like a—" And then he stopped, and he thought, and then he said quietly, "I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon." And Mr. Bacon smiled. "My pleasure," he said. So carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off for home up the hill. Then he stopped and he thought, and then, do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe is something Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun. Mr. Noisy arrived at the door. He put his hand out to the door, and then he stopped, and then he thought, and then, do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly, and then stepped inside. He shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Noisy had never tried before. They were fun too. And do you know something? Mr. Noisy isn't as noisy as he used to be. The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy even tried to